Welcome. How's everybody doing? David here for this week's Griscom stream. Hope you're doing well wherever you are at. Broadcasting to y'all from the great state of Texas. We're going to be talking a little bit of Texas stuff up at the top. But folks, just so you know, these are the Griscom streams are more casual, so feel free to jump in the chat with any questions. This one, it's been a little while. We've had guests a few times the past few weeks on these, so figured we're probably overdue to sort of hang out and get y'all to ask some questions. I know we have some already submitted from our patrons in the Discord, which I will start with. But if you have anything, I'm generally down to talk about whatever. And of course, we do appreciate super chats, but obviously we don't require those to be able to ask a question. Before I get into the YouTube chat, we got to tell this quick story, and Joe Snuffy asked about it, so we can get started with it. Joe Snuffy from the Left Reckoning Discord says, the Paxton news talking about our Attorney General here is interesting, but I find it next to impossible to imagine that the Texas GOP ledge will assert any power over him, not after they've rolled over to grant him and Abbott unchecked power for years now. This seems like the last gasps of a fallen political faction, which is only now realizing that it's lost. Am I missing anything? Well, I'll answer that, but maybe let's just set the stage for folks who aren't up to date as to what's been happening here. So we played this on the show on Tuesday. I'll just play a couple seconds of it. This video leaks over the weekend. This was public. This was at the legislature. Dade Phelan, the Speaker of the Texas House, speaking, slurring his words, appearing inebriated.
The chair recognizes Mr. Johnson of Harris. Mr. Johnson of Harris to speak in opposition to the bill.
This video comes out, and shortly after that, Ken Paxton, our Attorney General in the state, who is, for people who are unfamiliar, has had a host of legal problems. He's under investigation by the FBI. He's cost the state significant amounts of money to pay off whistleblower lawsuits against him. And as all this is going on, he was under active investigation from the Texas House for potential felonies. So this video leaks, and Ken Paxton tweets out a little bit afterwards, Dade Phelan should resign. And if that shows you anything, it means that there is a very serious crack in the Republican Party in Texas. One that I could have told you all about before. I mean, remember, we're at the end of our legislative session, which means that there's a big rivalry typically between the House and the Senate as to whose bills are going to get passed, what version of the bills and priorities are going to get passed. And there's always been this kind of tension in Texas politics that has really exploded this week, but it's been boiling over for a while. So I think one thing is important to remember about Texas politics is yes, we do have effective one party rule in the sense that the majority in both the House and the Senate are the GOP, and the state government executively is run by the Republican Party. But there are all sorts of factions within the Republican Party, which is probably good for the rest of us, because it means that they aren't always successful in getting all the nasty stuff that they want out. Anyway, so this sort of boils over. We talked about it a little bit on Tuesday, and then and Ken Paxton calls for Dade Phelan to resign. Then the House releases their report on Ken Paxton, where they found, in addition to the other issues that Ken Paxton is facing, multiple felonies, particularly with his involvement in his relationship with a real estate developer in the Austin area, where Ken Paxton has been accused of abusive official capacity for diverting senior employees to perform work that benefited this real estate developer here, something around $72,000 paid for by the taxpayer, misuse of public information for providing Paul, the real estate developer, with an internal FBI file related to an investigation into the developer, and another one of a misapplication of fiduciary property for allegedly hiring an outside lawyer for $25,000 to work inside the Attorney General's office without the knowledge or consent of senior staff to perform work that allegedly was to the benefit of this real estate developer. So I mean, corruption all the way through. Um, that happens. The question will be like, what will come out of it? And then just literally a few hours later, Scott Braddock, a Texas journalist, tweeted this out, which is a dumpster at the Texas Attorney General's office. For some reason, it had caught fire. The Texas Attorney General's office tweeted out a video, which I can, we don't need to watch it, but I can explain it to y'all. Tweeted out a video over here saying that they're looking for information for the person responsible for this quote unquote arson. Um, and the video that they're alleging is this one here, where somebody, it's impossible to tell, what this person looks like or who they are. They're saying this person walked through and put a lit cigarette inside of the dumpster. So look, I don't know how much I can speculate on that, but very, very weird stuff happening right here in the state of Texas. To answer Joe's question, though, like what will come out of this, I can't necessarily say, but I won't sit here and tell y'all that I think there's no chance that Ken Paxton gets in trouble. There's a lot of things that are in his favor for him being able to get away scot-free. But I think it's really important to remember that there are significant fractures in the Republican Party. This was also highlighted that while all this stuff is going on between Dade Phelan and Paxton, there was a massive bloodbath in the Texas legislature where both parts of the legislature, the House and the Senate, were just killing each other's bills. We're just ripping the other chamber apart. Incredibly dysfunctional. And remember, we only have a few more days left until Texas won't have, government in session until, for 2 years. So, we're almost at the end of the legislative session. Governor Abbott can call for a special session. Probably is likely that he will do that to try to push forward school privatization. But the calendar is dwindling, and there are very serious fractures that are appearing right now. And I think, you can't sit here and I will boldly sit here and say that they're going to impeach Ken Paxton. But I also wouldn't say that it's sort of out of the cards. Like, we're gonna have to be watching it, seeing who's being talked to by members of the Republican Party, because basically there are two factions right now. Dade Phelan now is personally implicated in this because Ken Paxton's trying to kick him out of power. Dan Patrick and I think Greg Abbott too are very angry at the House Speaker Dade Phelan, who again is a Republican. So that, there's an attempt to weaken his power. So there's a lot of people who might be backing Paxton. But as you're seeing, there's more motivation in the House. Briscoe Kane, a real wacko right-wing member of the House, when this video came out of Ken Paxton's dumpster on fire, tweeted out, "What the hell's going on?" Right. So, the Republican Party here isn't as in lockstep as I think some people might believe. But here's where it gets difficult. There's three things that you can do, right? Ignore what happened to Ken Paxton, right? Just ignore it. The House can just do nothing. They can censure him, which is strongly worded reprimand, or they can impeach him. The problem is that, again, as I said, there's only a few more days left, literal days left in the Texas legislative session. So to be able to impeach Paxton, the House would have to vote to impeach, and they would need a majority to do that. Then the Senate actually can stay in session longer for the purpose of doing a impeachment trial. So that's a possibility. There, they would need to have a 2/3 majority to impeach Ken Paxton. So that's a high ceiling. Also, really important to note that one of the senators in the Texas Senate is Ken Paxton's own wife, Angela Paxton. So it'd be interesting to see what even happens there. So the governor could call the House back in after the session's over to try to force impeachment on our attorney general. The House members could petition to have a special session called, but the clock's running out basically. And that's probably the most beneficial thing for Ken Paxton. And I don't think that everybody in the House thought that the charges against Ken Paxton were going to be as serious as they were. I think it was also purposeful that this report comes out so late in the session, so that even if it is inflammatory like it is, it will be difficult to do. So, anyways, the good news about all of this is that if it can take up the Republican Party's time in the last few days of the legislative session to prevent them from putting forward some of these other really nasty bills that they're trying to put forward that are waging war on working people, on immigrants, on trans people, that's a damn good thing, and I'm here for it. But anyways, I'm opening this up to questions. I know I have a few more in the Discord. I will start going through the chat though to make sure that I'm not ignoring y'all. But folks in the Discord, don't worry. I will get to your questions in just a second, and let's catch up. It's been a little while since we've done one of these. So, our good friend Ziggy says, "Hey y'all. After hearing about Target removing their Pride merch, I went to see if any of it is still there. It was still there, although behind the plus sizes of maternity clothes way in the back. Hail Satan, plus size, and prego people." Yeah, I haven't checked. I mean, it's just the frothing of the mouth. It's amazing to watch the MAGA movement turn into a big consumer boycott organization, um, and it's really, really unfortunate to see a company like Target. Target, nasty company, folks. Let's not do this game. And it's shown again by how quick they were to start pulling things off their shelves. And I know is it Lidra or Lidra? I can't read the name well, but I know I have a question from you in the Discord. I will get to in just a second. But they want to know: does our intro and outro songs have a name? No, they were recorded for us by Matt's good friend Christoph Brun. I'll put that in the chat later if you're unfamiliar. Who's a really amazing musician and guitarist. So he did all the Left Reckoning music for us, actually. Michael Reich says, with such depleted ranks, how likely is it that there will be a popular uprising in Russia? I don't know. I mean, I think it would take a lot of confidence in something mobilizing that would be better, and not just better in the sense of like policies or politics, but something that seemed to be capable of running, the state if you even wanted to entertain that. And I'm just not familiar enough with on the ground movements in Russia to comment on that, really. John says, "Can we link our Discord in the chat, please?" I have no idea how to do that. Secret Asian Dan says on the Vivek Chibber interview, Dave, I listened to the Vivek Chibber discussion, and I feel like the dynamic Chibber raises between the educated and the working class could also be raised. Well, he's very clear, I think, about it being the middle class. But could also be raised between Chibber himself and the educated. To some degree, it feels like a fetishization of the working class. Is there any validity to this feeling, or does that seem? What do you mean by fetishization? I mean, this is like the central concept of Marxism and revolutionary politics, right? Is that we live in a class society, and there is a class that produces, and that is the class that is also exploited. And the idea being that capitalism creates the conditions for its own undoing by creating this class, the proletariat, the working class, that has the potential to revolutionize society. And if you look through history, you see many examples of the radicalism that's in the working class, and you also have to see while at the same time recognizing the hurdles to class consciousness and things like that, right? This is sort of what the discussion we had with him was about. I don't know how you could consider that to be a fetishization rather than sort of a materialist look at the way that society, that power is distributed in society. But maybe I'm missing your question. Are a bunch of Texans moving to Oklahoma? Well, I don't know if they're welcome back. Sorry, friend. Okay, let's see. Um, Trying to make sure I'm not missing any questions. We have some more in the Discord. I'm a little bit behind y'all. Well, what Vivek is saying is no, 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 no. Secret Agent Dan says, I read Vivek is saying the non-working class is deluded by their ideology. The working class sees clearly without the lens of ideology. No, what Vivek is talking about is that the working class and the middle class have different interests, and the interests of the middle class are regularly reflected in left and progressive politics, despite how a lot of left and progressive politicos or members of those movements talk about themselves. A lot of them have these more middle class demands for society. What Vivek is talking about when he's talking about interest is a really important bit. um, Wherein, there's all this kind of scolding, for example, of like working class people to not back upper middle class to the upper class in general's political projects. And that I'm talking about, for example, the Democratic Party, and people saying, oh, they don't understand their own interests, right? Well, he's saying that, like, no, people are much more rational and reasonable than you give them credit for. um you know it, the the limitations of our understandings do not come from us not understanding ourselves and our own interests, but like our ability to have access to high quality information. Particularly, if you're not being able to spend a lot of time understanding, economics in the world around you. Hell, a lot of wealthy people who have time and the ability to do that, those things, don't understand those things either. So it's pushing back on this really nasty idea that a lot of liberals have, that working people are sort of incapable of understanding themselves and understanding their own interests, because one, that's extremely condescending, and two, that's no basis for building a real political movement, right? Because you're effectively excluding people from being able to participate in politics. One of like the key arguments that Vivek Chibber makes, both in the interview we did with him and in other writings that he does, is that most people resist individually. They resist capitalism individually rather than collectively, because that is the thing that is the most immediate, that is the most accessible to them, because we don't have access to mass party politics, or in a lot of cases, like real trade union movements, right? So a lot of people deal and recognize that they're being exploited, but rather than sort of joining a socialist party or, something like that, find ways to resist, individually, right? Or figure out a way to get by individually. And that is a very reasonable reaction to depoliticization in society. The role of socialists is trying to bridge that gap. But that's a very different project than this kind of pessimistic idea that you see all the time on the left, that everyone is just sort of sleepwalking through life. They don't understand that things are messed up and that something needs to be done. People are well aware that they're being screwed over. Um, what's more immediate and oftentimes more fruitful, with a lack of political mobilization, is acting individually. Um, and that's sort of like the fundamental point. I mean, you can also read Matt Karp's work on this in the New Left Review. That he just published a piece a couple months back on deep on class D alignment, talking about some of these more traditional democratic strongholds in the Midwest, particularly like in Minnesota, that have flipped, and comparing those to a lot of those more wealthy conservative bastions in Minnesota in particular, that have now flipped, to the Democratic Party, right? So people who traditionally voted for the Democratic Party, who were working class, voting for Trump in the Republican Party in the most recent elections, and then the wealthy gated communities now flipping to like the left liberal project. This is class D alignment, and it's really important to be able to understand these things. Okay. I'm sorry. We have a lot of good friends in Oklahoma, but as a Texan, we have to. I have to let people participate in this. Tony says I'm trying to get out of Texas, but still rather live here than Oklahoma. There y'all go. Y'all could fight about Oklahoma versus Texas in the chat. Okay, I want to get because I have questions in the Discord, and I want to get to questions, but just like I know this wasn't a question, but people were talking about ideology in the chat too, and I think that one thing that's really important to understand about ideology is that ideology is oftentimes misunderstood as the root cause of action or activity, rather, which is incorrect. Ideology is a product that is meant to be consumed to justify your activities in the world, right? And this is where a lot of people get confused about ideology, where it's like, oh, if we eradicate this ideology, or if I can see, without this ideology, then I'll be free, right? And it takes a materialist understanding of ideology, which is like an intellectual product that is consumed to justify activity. Um, and it turns it into this like very powerful spiritual force. To give you like a very concrete example, a very common like liberal line, for example, on like colonialism, is that colonialism came out of doctrines of like racial and civilizational superiority of like the West versus the East, right? Or to use modern terms, like of the global North versus the global South, right? And it's 100% true that you can read some of the most atrocious writings out there about these kind of things. But what was the real dynamic that was going on? The colonial forces wanted to go into underdeveloped parts of the world to exploit the labor there, to exploit the resources there, to make money. The justification of like, oh, we're on a civilizing mission, right? Which is absolutely racist and nasty and all that kind of stuff. But that's developed to give the justification for the activity, because it sounds better than just saying we need to go over there and just take their shit, right? And this is where people get mixed up about ideology and like focus so much on ideology, because if you think that the ideology is the engine, you're making a massive mistake, because it is like the desire for profit, the desire for exploitation, the need of capital to grow, that is like the engine of these systems of exploitation and of colonialism, um, generally, right, throughout history. And this is something that is like very, very popular, in particularly, in the liberal world, where it's like the justification is the reason why they're doing it, instead of the justification being a product to be consumed to help you make sense of your nasty colonialist activities, for example. um Just Binia says, I used to uh, feel like why are people all voting against their interests, but I've come to believe it's just internalized nihilism. The greater is impossible so it's reasonable to be selfish. I mean, or also it's just like, what's the point in helping out someone else's political career? I mean, like, one group of people who never get spoken to are non-voters in this country. Um, and like, it's like obviously, like, we know the differences, for example, between like a Republican and a Democratic Party, but like, we have case studies of what happens under one party rule in the opposite direction. California is a state of massive and ripe inequality. um it's like, is that like a worker state? No, right? Is it better to have certain kind of labor protections that you might get under Democratic Party? Sure, you can make that argument. But this idea that people are sort of denying this very clear choice to them, right? We're not even talking about voting Republican. I'm talking about non-voting. I think is a big reach when you look at what happens when Democrats are in control of government. Um, which is why I think like so much of like left socialist discourse over the past few years has been trying to figure out how to handle our weakness at the moment, trying to figure out a way to move the dial to get improvements for working people. And that's why there's all these kind of fights about whether or not democratic socialists, for example, should run under the banner of the Democratic Party, right? And I'm sure that will come up later and we can talk about that more in depth then. But like what it really comes down to is that until you have like a very strong independent working class movement, call it whatever you'd like, um, you're going to basically be hoping that powerful people see it in their heart, to help out working folks, and like that's also not a very rational position, in my opinion. I know, Rob says in the United Kingdom we had the Enough is Enough movement that had something like almost a million people sign up to it, but it had a lack of specific demands and ran out of steam. I've been very disappointed to see like the lack of utilization there. It's frustrating to see the demand and to not see that translated into action. It's been very upsetting. But just in, just saying about Oklahoma, since as people are still talking about it on the chat and stuff, Oklahoma has a really radical social tradition. A lot of people forget that like the hotbed of American socialism was in states like Oklahoma and Texas and in Arkansas. I'm working on a long book review on the Southern Tenant Farmers Union for Jacobin that hopefully will be out in the next few weeks, maybe next month. But like it's truly striking to see like the actual history of this part of the country, and how people sort of think about it, particularly when you remember that like we're talking about the 1920s and the 1930s, right? So not that far removed generationally from people today. This kind of radical homegrown socialist tradition, explicitly so. So like I'll shit on Oklahoma because I have to, it's the law as a Texan. But Oklahoma has a very proud tradition to stand on. Okay. I need to get back to these Discord questions, and then I can take more from y'all. But Lenny has a note for us. Hey, David, as you know, the expiration of the public health emergency, many expanded funding for programs such as SNAP, food stamps, essentially, folks, and Medicaid have been terminated. Millions of poor and working people are losing healthcare in the coming months, and SNAP benefits for an individual have been reduced from $281 a month to $23 per month. We have not seen any protests, nor outcry from a representative or coverage around these issues from the perspectives of the people. Why is there no interest within populist? I think you're saying like populist, or the working populace, the working population of the United States to rise and protect against these policy decisions like the French with the raising of the retirement age. Well, I'll just say generally, I think the lack of like political energy around this has been extremely disappointing to me. We've covered it and talked about it a decent amount on this program, but it just for it's a real indictment, I think, of where a lot of things are right now. That this has been met. I think calling it silence is wrong because there's plenty of people who are upset about it. There's plenty of people who are covering about it, and there's plenty of people who've been advocating against these cuts. But as like a larger political movement, and like let's call it as it is, I would point my finger more directly at the progressive movement than like the socialist movement. And I think these are the schisms that it becomes really difficult post Bernie, because Bernie was like the standard bearer of two movements, one larger and one smaller, right? The larger one being the quote unquote progressive movement, which is very big tent, and it goes everywhere from like radicals and democratic socialists to like progressive capitalists who want to see a nicer version of capitalism, right? But that is undoubtedly a larger political movement, both in terms of voters, in mobilization, in money. And certainly in like media reach right now than like the socialist movement is. um Seeing the failure to like that this story when this was happening, that it became a passing story, I think is really, really damaging. But the last question is, why is there no interest within the working population in the United States to rise and protest against this? It's because we haven't developed class consciousness in this country. Most people don't think of themselves as members of the working class in the US. And there's a long process to demobilize that process. People think of themselves as all sorts of things, right? Regionally, right? I'm one of those people. I think of myself as a Texan, as a Southerner. Um, we have all these other competing identities that sort of play that central role in sort of having people define themselves, and the hope of here's like a thing that's really important to understand. I think a lot of people get mixed up is that, like, you know class consciousness is something that has to be developed, right? No one is sort of born with the innate consciousness. People like understand themselves in the world in a general sense, but oftentimes in a very fractured way, right? Not necessarily as being a member of the working class, or even when they're thinking about their boss, right? My boss is exploiting me, right? But a lot of times that's like a personal relationship. It's like my boss, that individual is doing this, right? They're greedy, they're this, they have this kind of thing, instead of the more general sense of like bosses, or right, the capitalist class, the ownership class have it out for me. And that understanding is something that has to be developed, and you won't be able to develop that on a mass political scale without some kind of serious organization. Movement is like a word that we use a lot. It's a good placeholder. I use it all the time. But movement is too disperse of an idea in politics, right? What is a movement, right? It's a bunch of individuals working in concert, and there's something that is sort of directing them in some way or the other. That could be something as loose as just like what media people consume, right? That's very different from like an organization, a union, a party, which is what you fundamentally need to be able to develop that kind of consciousness. France has been decimated for generations. It's a country that's run by neoliberals, just like the United States. But there was a stronger working class movement in that country that did not get pushed down and put away. I mean, like, the thing that's interesting about France too is they don't even have their you think that their union density was significantly higher than the United States. It's not. um there's something in the French political history, in the French cultural history, that helps people understand that these attacks against maybe this group of workers is also an attack on you. um and that's certainly missing in this country right now. um okay, I'm going to go down um to the bottom of this. If I miss anyone's question, I'm sorry. Just maybe ask it again. I want to make sure I'm getting the Discord questions in while we can. Joe Forte in the Left Reckoning Patreon says, I've been thinking about Rick Scott's laughable travel advisory against communists and socialists visiting Florida. Why do you think the far right has been so obsessed with labeling and targeting all of their opponents as communists and far left radicals? Because it's been a tool that's always been available to them. Again, as I was saying, I'm working on this review of the radical tradition in the South, right, in Arkansas, Oklahoma, and Texas. And you know, all the time people are being called reds and communists, and like oftentimes like it might be true, or there might even be a legitimate association, but it was used because, one, it seems like, oh, this is a movement that's like against democracy, and two, that it's a foreign importation. And that's a big reason I think that communists and socialists have been able to be utilized as such slurs in this country, because it seems like, oh, this is not like a genuine representation of like American workers, but rather some kind of nefarious foreign involvement to try to destroy the country. So it's always going to be there until we are able to define it and own those terms. And again, like, we talked about a little bit when it comes to Florida. It's like, I think it's funny and goofy. I think we should also take these things seriously, because a travel advisory is like some level of a threat. I don't think that you should be losing sleep about it necessarily, but I mean, um, things can accelerate very quickly. But the other thing is, like, they're calling the Biden administration the force that's creating the socialism and communism in this country, which is completely erroneous. Um, so it's a winner for them, and I think it's why it's really important to actually be able to own those terms and start defining them publicly as much as possible, and not being shy about what it is that you think. Because there's always these kind of tendencies that's like, well, maybe we should not call it socialism anymore, right? Um, because it carries too much baggage. They're going to call you that. If you act like you're a secret socialist, it makes it seem like there's something in that term that you're afraid of, and I think that that's not a good strategy. For fun, they also want to know, what kind of beer are you and Matt drinking lately? Well, I can't speak for Matt. I will say generally I'm a Lone Star and Shiner kind of guy most of the time. I do like St. Arnold's Brewery a lot. They have a lawnmower beer that I've been enjoying. Um, so I'll get back to the YouTube chat in just a second, because there's one more question sort of on the same subject that we've been talking about, from Lurda. Lurda. I'm sorry if I'm saying your name wrong, friend, by the way. Oh, you pronounced Elurda. Elurda. Apologies. Um, Elurda. There we go, I think. During the interview with Vivek Chibber, he stated something along the lines of, the only way to affect real ideological change in the American political process is through presidential elections, because that's when everyone's paying attention to politics. And I think buried somewhere in the implications of that statement, that the US political system, and more specifically the US Constitution, is malleable enough to interpret it into a true socialist communist labor program. Could you expand on that? Because I'm not 100% convinced that that's true, but I feel um, as it may be, because Vivek is obviously correct. Yeah, I mean, I was trying to listen through before we went live to see if I could get his exact quote. I couldn't find it, but so I might focus more on the second part of that question. Is the U.S. reformable? Um, I mean, the United States system is set up to prevent against mass rule, as they would call it, mob rule, right? This is something that's in the Constitution. This is why we have something like a Senate. And remember, the Senate initially wasn't even popularly elected, right? It was elected by state representatives. Right. So, and that's already, and that's a part of the U.S. system that's already enjoys more power than the most directly um, um, the most like direct, the part of the government that is the closest to the people, and I'm talking about the House of Representatives. Why? Because the House of Representatives is elected every 2 years. It's a smaller pool than a senator, right? Because the senator represents the entire state. um, you have more influence over your congressperson than you do your senator. And so why does the Senate basically get to sit on top of the House as well? It's because the Senate represents the more powerful interests, right? While the House has more potential of being more reflective of the general body. And obviously, what else do we have? We have gerrymandering. We have all these things that try to deny people their rights to vote. So it's not even saying that that's perfect, but like in theory, the House is something that is at least can be potentially more reflective than like the Senate can be. My opinion, we should eradicate the Senate. The Senate doesn't represent people. It represents power, right? It represents arbitrary state borders. And as we were just saying, it was designed as a check on popular will. There are issues with the Constitution as well, but I also think that we shouldn't shy away from holding up the more radical aspects of the Constitution. Because remember, the thing in American history and American politics is that you have this document, particularly at the time too, that was among one of the more radical um, out there, right? In the rights that it outlined of like the individual over the state. Um, but there's the contradiction, because we have human slavery in this country, right? So like, does having like a constitution that outlines certain things prevent these kind of attacks on people? No, obviously you can't say that if you look at American history. So is the American system reformable? I think that the way you have to think about it is more that there are things that we have to be able to. The end goal is trying to build workers' power and to build some sense of a worker state. And what I mean by that is like a state where the interests of the working class are reflected in politics as the dominant force in politics. Um, So how would you go about, reforming the state? I don't know if I would be able to sit here and comfortably say that I think that like you could reform away the state. I think that eventually, like if you're talking about really building socialism, there would have to be some radical break with some of these things. In the interregnum, in the meantime, what needs to happen? Well, what needs to happen is we need to be building out more openings, places for people to be more involved in the state apparatus, so that we can utilize and hold sites of power, and develop our capacity and our capabilities of building a workers movement, right? So like in the short term, if we could, like, this is why we were talking about this a little while ago when it comes to this debt ceiling thing. Earlier today, the Supreme Court just severely curtailed the ability of the EPA to regulate, to enforce the Clean Water Act, right? A huge blow to the environment and to the country. The Supreme Court has taken away the right to have an abortion. Um, you can go down the list. The Supreme Court is a reactionary institution. It always has been. It's not like it's just been corrupted by Trump. It's always been an anti-democratic force in this country. So a radical socialist, a radical democratic concept is like, we need to curtail the power of the Supreme Court, right? So anything that you can see in American politics right now that is trying to weaken or check the power of the Supreme Court is a good thing. The Biden administration is not going to is so willing to bend over backwards to protect the sanctity of the Supreme Court. Liberals generally are. But if you can continue to build up those tensions and those contradictions, so that even if you have like an upper middle class interest in weakening the power of the Supreme Court, that is helpful in the short term. So when we're thinking about like how to engage in politics right now, I think thinking about it purely in the sense of like party dynamics is wrong. What you should be saying is like, what are the major hurdles to socialist politics right now? The Supreme Court is clearly one of them. So are there places where we can participate in politics that weaken the power of the Supreme Court, right? Those are places that we should be involved in politics. So how do we reform the state? I mean, it's going to take direct confrontation with those apparatuses that limit the power of the state. If you're interested, if you didn't check or listen to it the first time, we read Rosa Luxemburg's Reform and Revolution, where she directly challenges like the reformist impulses in the socialist movement at that time. It's a phenomenal text. We had a lot of fun covering it. If you'd like to, definitely check that out. It's all up for free for people who aren't patrons, though you should be a patron if you aren't already. And so she basically, I think I tend to agree with Rosa, right? That like, yeah, the state as it currently exists, it's a fool's errand to think that you're going to be able to reform away, all of these problems. But she does say that like, oh, it's very important actually for the socialist movement to be engaged in these struggles and to actually be coming up against these impediments to working class power. Because one, it increases our ability to be organized and mobilized. It makes our case very, very clear. And we learn those lessons about where exactly those safeguards against popular rule, against democracy exist in the current state. Basically like the quick answer to that is that, you know, we have to be able to do two things at once: recognize the undemocratic aspects of the American system, but two, recognize that participating in politics is really, really important, if nothing else, than to expose these kind of fundamental contradictions that exist within our system. Okay, I'm going back to the YouTube chat now, friends. And I really appreciate that question a lot. That's a good one, and I'm happy people really were enjoying the Vivek interview. That was one of the more fun ones we've done in a while. Rip Steakface says, I think it's important to ask ourselves, what will success look like with this bill, act, statute, etc. What is the solving, and what will it look like when the problem is solved? I totally agree. I would just add to that. I also think that, as I was just saying before, like if Bernie Sanders were to have become president, and I know for people who've been longtime listeners, you've heard this bit before, but I'll do it again. Bernie Sanders would have become president. It would have been an immediate fight with the state apparatus. Immediate. Do you think that Bernie Sanders, even if he had the congressional votes to pass Medicare for all, the Supreme Court 100% would try to destroy that? They did that to Obamacare, for fuck's sake, right? One of the more conservative strategies for how to deal with the healthcare crisis in this country. He would have immediately come up against the state. What would that have meant? Well, it would have meant either defeat or it would have meant mobilization and potentially overcoming those hurdles, overcoming the power of the Supreme Court, overcoming maybe the power of the Senate. It maybe could have also been defeat, but a very serious attempt to curtail and weaken those powers of the government that are reactionary, that represent the rich, that don't represent the people. Um, and that would make the movement stronger as well, because then everything becomes clarified as to what parts of the state operate in which ways. I think it's really important for socialists to take the state seriously. Um, there was a long time kind of conception of the state as solely just the the London quote is something along the lines of like the state is the executive committee of the bourgeoisie, right? And absolutely, we live in societies that privilege legally property over people, right? There, you just can't deny that. Again, we had to live in a country that has a history of literally holding up property rights over people's human dignity, right? Talking about slavery. So there's no doubt that that fundamental contradiction exists in America and in American politics and American history in the American legal system. Um, but you also have to recognize that the state operates independently at times from the capitalist class. They act in the interests of capitalism and the capitalist class, but not in the way that capitalists always want them to. What I mean by that is that the role of the state in like capitalist democracy is not just to sort of put flows of capital into the pockets of the wealthy, but rather to protect the capitalist system from collapse, right? That's why, for example, even like progressive reformers of capitalism, they're still capitalists. So what they're doing is they're trying to alleviate some of the contradictions and crises that come out of the business cycle, that come out of the capitalist system, not to eradicate capitalism, but actually to prevent its collapse. Um, and you have to understand that the state is filled with institutions and with people and with cultures with that kind of understanding or with that kind of mission. So when we're dealing with the state, we have to really spend a lot of time looking to what the state actually does, and being able to understand how the state operates. And that's why, for example, one thing that's been really frustrating with even some of our elected representatives has not only been the votes that they're taking, but the lack of knowledge sharing. Right, like an ideal socialist political movement would work something like this: you have accountability from elected officials to the base, but you also have knowledge sharing, because if you are in government, they understand who has power, who has influence, who's being able to call shots behind the scenes in a way that you will never be able to gather from the outside looking in. So like a socialist model would be something like certainly have the accountability, right? There's a focus on this accountability, but one thing that really needs to be added to that equation is this knowledge sharing, the knowledge that people in positions of power have. There's a responsibility for them to come back to the movement, not only to just be accountable to that movement, but to also be able to explain and to do that kind of political education within the movement itself as to what is actually happening within the state. And that's not been the dynamic that we have right now. What's up, Rachel? Rachel has a question. I don't have an answer. I don't know about this, but thanks for bringing it to our attention. Rachel says, will you comment on Rwandan genocide fugilance Kayashima's recent capture of South Africa? He'd been on the run as an internationally wanted man since 2001. I don't know anything about that, but I'd love if there's any info you want to share with us, I'll share it with everyone else, and would be happy to talk about that sometime in the future. So I have about 10 more minutes, folks, by the way, because I have to run. We're recording our bonus episode with Emma Vigeland in just a bit. But if anyone has any last questions, I will be happy to take them. Um, and our good friend Comrade, congressional baseball fan, says Bernie kept saying not be us, and it was going to have to be that way for a presidency too. I don't know why so many were expecting him to be some kind of magical wizard. Yeah, I will say I've been pretty disappointed with Bernie, in recent months, but I totally agree. I think that "Not Me, Us" slogan was really good in general. KD6 says, thoughts on the lottery. I mean, it's interesting if people are familiar with the lottery in the South, particularly in Louisiana. The lottery, the lottery was an incredibly politically powerful institution. It was completely rigged. It was a massive amount of capital, and it was utilized to help with the revivalists, right? The people who were trying to restore some of the old aristocratic power to the South during Reconstruction. So it's different in all different states. We got a lottery here much later, um, but it does have a pretty sordid history across the country. Kowalski from Nebraska says, "Is it was the spirit of John Brown a legal defense? It isn't yet, but in my society, it absolutely would be." Charles's Ghosts wants to know, Willie Nelson is coming to Richmond. At what price point should I not attend? Ooh, that's a tough. I mean, I've been lucky. I've seen Willie play my entire life. I think the most recent I saw him was in 21, 22. It was an amazing show as always. I will say if I didn't know, for example, that Willie Nelson had said that he wants to die on stage, I would feel a little bit bad, just because he's obviously, a lot older. The day I saw him was like 105 degrees in the summer in Texas. I was dying. I can't imagine what it was like for him. Um, I don't know. I mean, if you could, it's worth it to see Willie Nelson if you haven't seen him because he still has it. Um, I probably generally wouldn't spend more than $75 on any show ticket generally, but that's just me. Our comrade Jay says, I've missed the last month or so of content, but will you guys have anyone from the WGA on the program? I can put you in touch with a few people if you need contacts. Yeah, send them our way. We haven't, but obviously we support the writer strike and have been trying to, support it in the ways that we can, but would love to do something with them if you have anyone in mind. I know we have a lot of people who listen to the show who have been on strike too. Um, Follow-up question here. From Ilirda. I'm sorry if I keep fucking your name up. I'm sorry, friend. Follow-up. Are you familiar at all with the different American party systems and the crises that led to each of their collapses? I noticed some similarities between the collapse of the Whigs and now. I mean, in the most in like a very general sense, I'm not prepared to do like a whole thing on the American party system. But like the thing that's really notable about American politics, even with all the different parties that we had here, is the prevalence of regionalism in American politics. It's been a really defining factor in U.S. politics that is pretty interesting, right? that, like regions tend to sort of go one way or the other. And a lot of that I think comes down to the lack of a real sustained working class party or labor party ever in the United States. Um, Generally, I'm most interested in the short history of the People's Party and then the later Socialist Party in this country. I'm curious what you mean by seeing similarities between the collapse of the Whigs and now. I think what we're seeing right now is a kind of recalibration of the Democratic Party. This started, it started with Carter, but it really accelerated, I think, under Clinton, um, of moving from a party of like the established labor movement, right? And I say that like that to say that like it was never, for example, a working class party, but it was one that was sort of dependent on powerful labor unions to fund it, and to act as a base of voting in places where those unions are strong. Um, but it's very clear that the Democratic Party for a long time has wanted to rid itself of that history. I think Bill Clinton really accelerated it. Obama certainly um, inherited a lot of it, and I think Biden is the culmination of the suburban strategy within the Democratic Party. Right, moving from um, moving to a party that represents more of that kind of doctor lawyer class. I can't suggest enough Matt Karp's piece. If you don't have access to it, send me a message on Patreon or send us an email at leftreckoning@gmail.com. And I'll see if I can get you a PDF of it. Matt Karp's piece on class D alignment on this country, I think, really highlights um, the precipitous decline's the wrong word, explosion in class D alignment that I think is really important to look at now to understand the Democratic and the Republican Party. And I think in general, we've done some things. If you want to check them out, if you haven't seen them, on like the class nature of the Republican Party, I think that's something that is generally sort of under theorized on the socialist left in general. And I think that that's a shame as well. And I think Rachel's 100% right here. Lotteries are a stealthy tax on the poor. Willie's 90, right? He just turned 90 last week. It's amazing how beloved Willie is. I just like I'm trying to think of other major American figures that like everybody sort of likes. I thought he was gonna get attacked more because he's obviously, he endorsed Beto. He in recent years. But Willie's always been pretty solid. I mean, Willie was a huge defender of Leonard Peltier, a member of the American Indian movement, who's still a political prisoner in this country, and he's been a supporter of him forever. So much so that like cops would protest Willie Nelson um, concerts across the country because of his support of Leonard Peltier. Willie's done a lot in supporting unions, particularly like the SEIU. Obviously, done a lot for farmers. Willie's one of the good ones. Kowalski, there's no plans for us to go on This Is Revolution, but maybe we should do something again with him sometime soon. It's been a little while. So yes, talking about the Whigs. So the Whigs seemed to collapse on the issue of slavery. They absolutely did. The abolitionists went on to the Republicans, and the pro-slavery section went on to the Dems. Whigs were a pro-industry party and had capital. But the thing about the Republican Party too, though, is that it was a weird combination of like northern business interests and like radical abolitionists. And like one of the great tragedies, we had Matthew Stanley on the show recently to talk about this more in depth. You should check that out. We talked about Reconstruction because Reconstruction is just like one of the great unfinished projects in American history. And it was pretty incredible how quickly the radical Republicans were sort of soundly defeated within the party. It was a longer process, but during the period of Reconstruction and that more northern business elite movement was able to take power and control the party towards the end. Talking about Matt Carp's piece. No, Matt Carp's piece is in the New Left Review. Hopefully, you're going to have him on sometime this summer. The Center for Working Class Politics, I think, has some big reports that are coming out, so we'll have him on. Oh yeah, of course. Rest in peace to Tina Turner. Peltier is still alive, and it's just such a shame. For people who aren't familiar with that case, we've done videos. You can just Left Reckoning, Leonard Peltier. It's the height of cruelty. I mean, it was from the very get-go, but like even the prosecutors in his case have said, yeah, the case against him was BS, and they think that he should be freed. And there's just it'll take the federal government, will take the president basically to pardon him, and Obama didn't do it. Biden doesn't seem to want to do it. I was begging for Trump to do it on Twitter, my own way. It's pretty devastating. We're also going to be releasing soon, talking about old folks. Kissinger's turning 100 this Saturday. We're going to be releasing our conversation with my conversation with Nick Terse, who's just uncovered more brutal war crimes by Henry Kissinger. And so keep your eye out for that and share it, because there's already a lot of hagiography and celebration of this monster, and it's incredible that he's still walking free. Okay, folks, I got to run. We're going to be releasing our bonus episode with Emma Vigland this Sunday for patrons. Sign up at patreon.com/leftreckoning. We got a lot of really great guests coming up. I've been going really wild getting folks. We're going to have Alex Hokley on the show, author of the end of history, also one of the co-hosts of the excellent Bunga Bunga cast. We're gonna have Nick French, Jacobin writer, on the program in June as well, to talk about why if you care about social justice, you should be a Marxist. I think we're gonna have Amina on the show sometime in June as well, to talk about her recent trip to Cuba with a great labor delegation there. I think we're gonna have Corey Pine on the program soon to talk about space privatization. Really looking forward to that. And as always, folks, really appreciate all of y'all. See you soon. I'll be releasing that interview on Saturday. This weekend, we have our bonus episode with Emma. Please support the show at patreon.com/leftreckoning, and I'll see y'all soon.